Good afternoon, all. How's everyone doing? Good. I hope so. It's kind of a gray day outside, but it's a good time to come inside and learn some history. My name is Jacob Rorm. I do public programs here at the History Center, and it is really a privilege to do this work because I get to share wonderful parts of our state and wonderful parts of our past with the public, and today is no exception. I can't take credit for this one. I have to thank my former colleague, Accommodations, who, before she moved on to a terrific position at History Colorado, put together some great programming and got it in place to go along with our new exhibit, Black Citizenship in the Age of Jim Crow, which opens today. That is open right now upstairs. It's a terrific exhibit put together by the New York Historical Society, really moving, and it covers very expansive and important history from the 50 years or so after the Civil War, which I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, that was not a period of history we spent a lot of time on in U.S. history. It was sort of Civil War on to World War I. Maybe some progressive era stuff around the turn of the century, but really we did not talk a lot about Reconstruction and its implications. We didn't talk about the onset of Jim Crow. We just talked about what happened later in the 50s and 60s. So this is a very important gap in a lot of our public understanding of the period after the Civil War and the fight for civil rights and racial equality. So I hope you have a chance to check it out. It is open till June 9th, so you have some time, but it will be open till 4 today before the museum closes. Other things you saw, there's a great programs coming up. A couple I want to draw attention to. We have our History Forum series continues next weekend with Blake Scott Ball, who wrote a terrific history about the political side of Peanuts. This goes along with our Schultz exhibit. Again, looking at Peanuts as a sort of ongoing political dialogue about some of the most pressing issues in the post-war decades. Things like women in sports, the nuclear age, racial integration, all of these things. The ways that Schultz sort of dealt with these in maybe not the most open ways, but very much a guiding a public conversation about these issues. So that is next Saturday. Tickets are available on mnhs.org or at our front desk outside. Also, March 9th, I want to draw attention, it was up there, Dr. Donald Iacovone is going to come and speak about his troubling new book called Teaching White Supremacy, where he surveyed decades worth of American history textbooks printed by Northern publishers and argues very convincingly, I might add, there's so much evidence here about the ways that it integrated white supremacist ideology into the ways we think about American history and American identity. It'll be a really terrific talk. That's March 9th. That's free, so come on back to hear that. It's going to be really a great opportunity to learn again about the ways American history is taught, which, as you know, not an untimely topic. So without further ado, I want to introduce our panelists today, and then we'll get the conversation started. So again, this is in connection with our Black Citizenship exhibit. That exhibit covers that 50 or so years, really breaking it down into sort of 3 chunks: Reconstruction and the efforts to, after the Civil War, sort of reconstruct America. And thinking most, particularly, you may be familiar with the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So abolishing slavery, expanding equal rights to all, and expanding suffrage to all, at this point, just men, but that included African American men who were formerly enslaved. And really the promise of extending those American values that had been sort of embedded in the Constitution and Declaration of Independence, at least spoken about, to more of those who were here in part of our nation. Of course, it also talks about the backlash to that, the ways that, particularly in the South, but all across the country, those particularly white people in positions of power did not like that. And the onset of Jim Crow segregation, the onset of sundown towns in the West and the Midwest, and really the really vicious and violent backlash to the expansion of citizenship and equality. And then the ways that through it all, Black Americans have always struggled to fight against that and to continue to pursue those ideals. So it's a terrific exhibit. And one of the things we wanted to do is, because this was organized by the New York Historical Society, we wanted to be able to bring a lens to Minnesota, what was going on here in those periods, what was the African American community like in those decades here and how that has laid the foundation for our Black community in Minnesota ongoing. So that's what our topic of the conversation. It's a huge topic. We don't have enough to cover everything, but I encourage you to seek out more resources. There's some on the back of your program. Our online encyclopedia, Minopedia, is a terrific resource. We have amazing articles on there about Black history in Minnesota. We also have some great YouTube series and programs that have been recorded on our YouTube channels. And then, of course, we have wonderful books in our bookstore right now, including ones that are specific to both the national story that the exhibit tells and ones about Minnesota. I'd also like to draw your attention to the books by one of our speakers today, Dr. William Green. He's really written the book on this time period for Minnesota, so check it out. It's a terrific book. Without further ado, let me introduce our panelists and we'll get going. So, Dr. William D. Green, he was the M. Anita Gaye Hawthorne Professor of Critical Race and Ethnic Studies and a Professor of History at Augsburg University up until 2022, so recently retired in that aspect. And he has really devoted his career to talking about, writing about, and teaching about race in Minnesota. Author of 4 books and numerous articles on history, law, and education. It's a really a joy to have him here. We also have Dr. James Robinson, who is Assistant Professor of Black Studies in the Ethnic, Gender, Historical, and Philosophical Studies Department at Metro State University, which also, just the title of that department, I love that. That's terrific. I want to be in that department. And in addition to his interdisciplinary work in Black Studies, he also has experience in the museum field, working as a researcher and curator for the Smithsonian. So we're delighted to have him here too, and his thoughts, particularly about the exhibit and its significance. So please join me and welcome them to the stage. So thank you again for both of you for being here and sharing your expertise and your thoughts and perspectives and with us and with our audience. So just maybe start us off, maybe Bill, could you give us sort of a brief overview of that time period around the end of the Civil War? What is the African American community in Minnesota like at the time? What has it been before that? Just to sort of give us a foundation to know what we're talking about in that period.
Well, we all know what Reconstruction meant, right? Can I assume that?
Well, I don't know. Maybe that's a good thing to talk about.
Okay. It's a time where the country's trying to mend itself after 4 years of Civil War, and actually after a century and a half of living in 2 different nations, in effect. The question finally was called, will we continue to be separate nations or one? One half the nation didn't like the answer yes, the other half didn't like the answer no, so we went to war 4 years. And at the end of 4 long years, bloody years, the North, the federal government, felt that there needed to be extra work done to try to redefine ourselves as a nation against those who did not want to. And Reconstruction quickly became not only an ideal for a new America, but a rallying cry for resistance or imposition, whatever way you want to see, whosever side you're on. And so Reconstruction, even though it was a time of promise and hope, and it was characterized by the redefinition of citizenship with the enactments of ratification of 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. That basically it was a time when we needed to look at people in a way that we've never looked at people before. That is to say, black people were viewed as people for the first time in the history of the country. And it was making real what that new view looked like, that equality and citizenship were very much a part of what it meant to be a person in this society for most African Americans, well, many African Americans. So Reconstruction became a time period where people were grappling with accepting that new relationship. And it was a bloody time, and it was a time where Americans Northerners, some Southerners, primarily Northerners, were put to the test as to how committed were they to be a new nation that included everyone. And so Reconstruction not only was a time period of high principle, of redefining ourselves, but it was also a test of how much fortitude does the nation have in redefining itself. And I think that I mean, one of the questions that we looked at was, that we considered was, you know, what was missed, I believe. Can you?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, so.
Can I
Yeah.
just, I think that there's another aspect of Reconstruction that's important to Minnesota, I think. Reconstruction was also reconstructing the nation, both in a physical sense, right? One of the important legislative acts was the act that created the Transcontinental Railroads, you know, which then brings the Northern Pacific and the Great Northern into play. Prior to the Civil War, the railroads were primarily Eastern phenomena. They were very local, short lines. Once the Transcontinental Railroad Act gets passed, there are 3 railroad routes nationwide that are created: a northern route, a central route, and a southern route. The northern, and all routes go through Chicago. Okay. But the northern route then connected the East Coast to the West Coast from Boston, New York, Chicago, St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Seattle, Portland, right? And so when I think of Reconstruction, I also add that into the mix, you know, because that brings us, meaning Minnesota, into the national story in another way.
Using that reference to railroads,
Yes.
When you look at topographical maps of railroads during this time, the railroad lines look like stitching. And so I've often referred to, some of my colleagues are here from the Augsburg days. We talked about how Reconstruction was a time of stitching the country back together again.
Exactly.
The belief that railroads would be. But that's all kind of a wish list of the policymakers and leaders of the nation at the time.
True, and it also plays into the 14th Amendment, because the 14th Amendment was also the way in which corporations gained legal status. And at that time, the railroads became the largest corporations in America, right? And that's part of the reason why you have, you know, the robber baron concept of railroads, because the owners of the railroads were able to get away with some things that they probably normally would not have been able to do.
So thinking about the role of the railroad, St. Paul, major railroad hub, you know, emerging in that late 19th century, how does that, what's Minnesota's role in the reconstruction of the nation in this period? How is it playing a part? Clearly with the railroads, maybe some of the impacts of those policies are now affecting Minnesota, but is Minnesota also playing a role in that, you know, insistence on expanding equality and expanding, you know, liberty?
Well, I think that when I've studied Minnesota history in this time period, and I'm really a 20th century historian, so you're getting me at the early phases of what I look at, because I look at primarily railroad workers, black railroad workers in specific. One of the things that the Minnesota does, I think, is begin to legitimize black suffrage, right? That it's one of the early states that allows, permits, legislates Negro at the time citizens to vote. I mean, after some, Bill knows more about this than I do, but after some dissension in the state legislature, finally, it's 1868, right, that African Americans are allowed to vote in the state of Minnesota, which is one of the earlier states to do this.
Yeah, what's noteworthy about that, aside from the ability to extend voting rights in '68, it took two tries before to do that, and it is, in my opinion, a study in leadership that with leaders, the right leaders, it is possible to persuade people to do what they didn't think was possible or that they were capable of doing or felt the right to do. Because most Minnesotans at that time did not believe that blacks had a right to vote. They were inheritors of a tradition of viewing African Americans as unequal, even though we were in Minnesota. And so it is remarkable that in Minnesota in 1868, as you said, that the voters, community leaders, policy leaders, political leaders actually went down the street and went to barbershops and went to persuade people to change their vote, to change their disposition. And some politicians actually said, you know, who were popular, if you support me, then you got to support black suffrage. Now, this is the issue behind Reconstruction. There was a clear sense of what this new revolution should do in order to be complete. That is to include all people, African American men in particular. But it also was one-dimensional, as these kinds of challenges tend to be. We want to change society, but the definition of that change is one-dimensional, to put it specific. Black suffrage did not guarantee African Americans the right to purchase property. It did not guarantee the right of parents, black parents, to expect their kids to be treated well in the schools. And other types of things that don't fall under the category of civil rights per se continued. There was discrimination continued. Blacks could not go to certain hotels and restaurants. Frederick Douglass was one who was denied a room in one of the more prestigious hotels and at a time when the Republican Party was meeting. So Reconstruction tended to become one-dimensional. We won the war. Those who resist Reconstruction are Confederates or ex-Confederates and Southerners and bad people. And in order for Reconstruction to continue, we have to fight. But there wasn't much discussion during Reconstruction to look at how to reconstruct an entire nation that included immigration. Huge numbers of immigrants are moving in. How are we going to integrate them in society? There wasn't much discussion about women's suffrage, which was a major issue, obviously, during this time period. And it goes on and on and on. These kinds of issues were not part of the new discussion of how we were. We missed the opportunity to truly redefine ourselves. And for that fact, it seems like that Reconstruction was allowed to become one-dimensional, and therefore, for those who were against it, equally defeated, equally overcome.
There's a great, well, great is not the right word. There's a part of the exhibit that talks about the institutions of Jim Crow and preventing suffrage that is now legally extended to black men, all of the various loopholes and things like poll taxes, literacy tests, that particularly southern states were using to prevent black men from voting. And it talks about in Mississippi, shortly after Reconstruction, the amendment extending suffrage, as many as 90% of black men in Mississippi were registered to vote. And within a handful of years, it dropped to 6% through all of these. So there was a really clear that was a major threat and that to the white establishment. And again, that's the part of just voting. As Dr. Green points out, that voting doesn't cure other ills necessarily.
But part of the
It's important.
Phenomenon there is that there were more black people living in Mississippi than there were whites. You know, Mississippi had the largest number of black voters, if you will, of any state in the South. I mean, so Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, all had almost equal numbers of blacks and whites at this time. Mississippi had more, almost 100,000 more black residents, right? So yeah, they probably had a fear. But one of the things that I've learned about—
You're about to say fear, and could you expand on that? Because I think that's what it comes down to in terms of understanding Reconstruction.
Well, one of the things that I've seen is that you had a large number of black individuals who had just gotten out of slavery, who had a leadership class that was relatively small of well-educated African Americans, and you had former slave owners who were no longer in a position of absolute power. And so therefore, the ability to control both the movement as well as the ideas of the new black citizens, you know, was at risk from their perspective. But some of those attitudes, and this is what I wanted to get to, some of those attitudes seem to migrate northward into Minnesota because there had been a long history of white Southerners coming to or moving to Minnesota, you know, bringing their slaves, you know, settling here, some of them in the military, some of them who became leaders in the state of Minnesota. And those attitudes seem to be some of the same attitudes that created this disparity between the ideas of Reconstruction, or radical Reconstruction, as it's sometimes called, and then the aftermath of Reconstruction. So I've heard about something called Copperheads in Minnesota. Do you know anything about that? Can you talk anything about that?
Yeah, but I want to go back to, you know, one of the key points that you're raising here. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
We'll have this conversation between—
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to know and to highlight that the attitude that you're describing, that is to say the willingness to sort of say, well, we're going to let the South handle this thing with regard to race relations, also springs from a notion of what I call fatigue. That is to say that during Reconstruction, in order to impose the new laws in the South, troops had to be there. And you push that a little bit further, and you see these troops comprised of young men who are still fighting a war that was supposed to have ended in '65. And that the parents of these troops are reading about how their sons are being shot at by these unreformed Confederates. Is that a term?
Yes.
Unreformed?
Unreconstructed?
Unreconstructed, exactly. And so they're saying, when is this going to end?
Yeah.
How much longer does my son, who I need back here on the farm and with our family as the holidays grow, how much longer are we supposed to sacrifice for them? And that kind of slips over into an attitude, well, why don't they cover themselves? Why don't they take care of their own interests? So you can see kind of a morphing of an attitude of those who supported the Civil War and were hostile to the Southerners, because, you know, every Southerner, you know, okay, I won't go there. I'm from New Orleans, so I can say that. The notion was that, you know, how much more do we have to do for those people? And I think that formed a sense of, you know, we've done enough. So that you see a lot of Northerners throwing up their hands. Real men stand up for themselves. That's the notion. And if they're not going to take care of their business, then they deserve what happens to them. Now, the message that they convey to the Southerners is that we continue to resist, you know, occupation, and the North will take care of everything else for us. They'll get rid of the president, which they did. They voted Grant out. The Northerners will get rid of Northern policy owners, policy makers who are imposing Reconstruction laws, as they did. We'll change the voting rights so that former Confederates can be elected once again to the Congress. And in time, the states, the southern states, can begin to redefine their own state constitutions that undercut what the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments could do on the watch of Republicans, on the watch of the people of the children of Lincoln, on the watch of a time when, you know, the winners are supposed to have the upper hand in policymaking. It's just waiting them out. And that's always been a challenge of any nation that has won and engaged in guerrilla warfare. It's sustaining the will to hang in there, even though the battles are not as distinct as they once were during a time of war. So I think, you know, the North allowed everything to go backwards. They justified it, Northerners justified it in some instances, or they allowed other issues to just become more important. And that's another challenge of any kind of revolution or change, social changes. If you spend enough time in the effort to try to change things, then eventually other issues become take more of a priority. And so, I didn't mean to go that long. I'm sorry.
No, you know, one of the facts that I've come across is that Minnesotans, white Minnesotans, during the Civil War, had about 70-some officers who were officers over colored troops, and that seems to be disproportionate, right? Given both Minnesota's size, population at the time, but also given the fact of the number of colored troops that there were. But what I've also read is that many of those white officers, you know, began to form friendships, relationships with their troops. Some of them even came back to Minnesota with the white officers. And so you get this settlement of veterans of color in various parts of the state of Minnesota, you know, which adds to the complexity of race relations in Minnesota. And so, you know, that kind of interaction is also what's going on during Reconstruction.
So you're also mentioning that, so this is prior to what the Great Migration or the Second Great Migration of the 20th century,
Yes.
where there's a lot of movement across the continent, particularly out of the South, of African Americans. So at this period, this sort of 19th century moment, post-Civil War, here in Minnesota, and we talked a little bit about this, that numerically the African American population was pretty small related to the general population.
Mm-hmm.
But even within that, even with it being a smaller community, it was not an insignificant community in terms of working towards racial equality and the fight for that on a national scale. Could you talk a little bit about that, some of the figures in that period and in the early 20th century who are really making a difference on a national scale coming out of Minnesota?
Well, the two people that come to mind, one is white, Ignatius Donnelly, a representative from the state of Minnesota, who is a strong supporter of Reconstruction and definitely a supporter of Negro suffrage and Negro equality. The other is actually a newspaper, the Western Appeal. The Western Appeal, it started in St. Paul. It then changes its name into the Appeal, but it becomes considered as the national Negro newspaper in the last half of the 19th century. It has offices in 5 other cities around the country. It is the vehicle by which national news among black folks is being transmitted.
I just want to jump in. We have that collection of newspapers digitized.
Yes,
so
you
if you
do.
want to read it, newspapers.mnhs.org, you can read the Western Appeal from the 1850s, the 1860s, and onward.
Yeah. Make sure when you do read it, you enlarge the size of the print, because it is very small. I mean, your eyes will get very sore if you don't. But then I think the person whose name sticks out the most is Frederick McGee. Frederick McGee is a lawyer by training. I think he's from Tennessee. Originally.
Mississippi, yeah.
Yeah, he was originally from Mississippi, lives in Tennessee, comes to Minnesota, earns his law credentials in Chicago, migrates to Minnesota. He's one of the first African-American lawyers in the state of Minnesota to practice before the Minnesota Supreme Court. McGee is involved in several national organizations, one of them the Afro-American League in the 1880s. As a representative of that organization, they're going to a national conference in Tennessee, need to get railroad tickets to go to the conference and purchase their tickets in a first class, whatever, railroad car, but then are denied their seats, right? And told that you have to go and sit in the colored section or go and sit in the smoker section. This offends McGee, right? He then says, I'm not going. At the same time, there is another gentleman who does the same thing in order to create a test case, a legal test case. And McGee is one of the attorneys who helps to represent him in this legal case about segregation on railroad travel. This is prior to the famous Plessy versus Ferguson case. So that McGee is at the forefront of the effort to stop segregation or Jim Crow in public transportation. But it doesn't stop there, right? And this is what backing up from what I originally knew, that yes, Frederick McGee was in the Niagra Movement. The Niagra Movement is a movement among African Americans to protest for their civil rights. Niagra Movement turns into what becomes the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. I'm like, wow, there's a black man from Minnesota involved in this, and I was like excited.
Well, just to add to that, the idea for the Niagara Movement begins in McGee's living room.
Exactly, that's where I was going.
When Du Bois comes here.
That's what I was going, yes.
So, go ahead.
Yes, no. And Frederick McGee, you're a black kid growing up in Minnesota and you find out about this guy, Frederick McGee, and you're like, wow, that's really exciting. But then I read W.E.B. Du Bois saying the whole idea for the Niagra movement was Frederick McGee's idea, right? And then I found out about this previous, legal case that he had been involved in. Frederick McGee is one of the leading figures in Minnesota's African American community. Lived in St. Paul, had been a member joined the Catholic Church, and there's some backstory behind that, I believe, right?
And the Democratic Party.
And yes, and left the Republican Party and joined the Democratic Party. This is in the 1880s, 1890s. Right?
This was before the Democratic Party becomes the Democratic Party, right?
Right. This is the old Democratic Party, and then unfortunately McGee dies. In, I think, 1912 or 1913, something like that. I think it's 12. Yeah.
I will say, as someone who works for the Minnesota Historical Society, I'm a little upset at the New York Historical Society that they have a picture of the first Niagra Movement gathering, and they do not point out Frederick McGee.
Yes.
They just talk about Du Bois.
Yes. Yeah, so when you do go through the exhibit, if you go through the exhibit, and please go through the exhibit, there is a photo of the Niagra Movement, and Frederick McGee is sitting in second row on the left-hand side with a little child on his lap. Okay.
How much does this tradition, thinking about the appeal, thinking about Frederick McGee and his work locally, but also on the national scale, how does that set the stage for the 20th century struggle for civil rights? And even locally, thinking about Roy Wilkins or Cecil Newman and the spokesman recorder carrying on these traditions, and then thinking up to today. I mean, how does this sort of what's happening in the 19th century sort of set the foundation for Minnesota in the 20th?
One way, and this, again, is, I think, unique to Minnesota. In the late 1880s, 1890s, there are a number of black lawyers who move to, migrate to, or go to school in Minnesota that I believe creates this sort of legal phalanx that makes Minnesota unique. So there's William Morris, Charles Squetchen, your boy, Frank Wheaton, Francis, W.T. Francis, William T. Francis, Lewis Irvin, Doug Crane, Lena Smith, all of whom become leaders in the community, but also have a national reach. And you mentioned Du Bois, right? A lot of people don't realize that W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the first African American to get a PhD from Harvard, one of the leading scholars, intellectuals of the 20th century, I would argue, co-founder of the NAACP, Crisis Magazine, author of Souls of Black Folk and Black Reconstruction, and all these achievements. He spends time in Minnesota, not just a one-time visit. Du Bois, during his college years, comes up to Minnesota during the summers to work at the resorts, like in Wayzata, Minnetonka, et cetera, et cetera. And that's how he gets to meet a Frederick McGee, right?
There's a wonderful picture. Sorry. There's a wonderful picture of a photo circa 1902 where Booker Washington and Du Bois, McGee and Ida Wells, and...
It's on your programs.
Oh, it's on the program? Well, what's key about that is, number one, they're here. They came to St. Paul to discuss an agenda for a modern civil rights movement. They came here to discuss it, and they came here because they They were impressed with the reputation of Minnesota as being racially progressive. That's something we can talk about, in time. But the key that I want to convey is that the stone wall that you see behind the leaders was the wall of the state capitol. The legislators voted to make the chambers available to these black leaders to have this discussion. And the governor of the state of Minnesota, Gus Van Sant, gave the keynote address. Now, what's notable about that is that Minnesota was noted across the country, within the black leadership, among the black leadership, being progressive. And to some extent, many of the leaders, political and business leaders of Minnesota, were indeed progressive on one plane, because while employers, the ones whose names appear in the big buildings in Minneapolis, they employed a lot of people except black people, but they were still sponsors of black activity, of African American activity. And so I think that becomes really the curious story of race in Minnesota, where on one hand, it's the paradox. On one hand, policymakers, very powerful men and women, took pains to support black activities, but at the same time did nothing when the Republican convention met in Minneapolis and did not have one African American represent Minnesota. And that's noteworthy because Mississippi had a black representative, that there were black representatives representing virtually all of the states of the Union, North and South. Minnesota did not have one. But that, to me, talks about the paradox of race relations. So when we're talking about Reconstruction, we have to consider how to think about the nature of the paradox, how it happens, why it happens. Anyway, that's another lecture, though.
You alluded to this question earlier, Dr. Green. This period, this sort of post-Civil War period, what do we get wrong about it now when we're looking back on it, and what do we miss? We've talked about some of this, but what is it maybe that, if there's anything we haven't talked about, that we often get wrong or misread about this period?
Well, I think what we get wrong about it is the lost opportunity to really reconstruct the nation and not being aware of that happening. I mean, it's not a part of our scholarship, it's not a part of our history books or history classes, where we even ask the question, did they succeed in what they set out to do? That's not even a question raised for students and scholars to grapple with. The other thing is that we overlooked the significance of hanging in with the struggle, not taking seriously, and I mentioned this before, that when you're talking about creating a social and political revolution, that's a big thing in this nation. But that's what it comes down to when you're talking about extending the franchise to people who had never had it. You're talking about changing the mindset of an entire nation. And you're talking about, in taking that on, being necessarily willing to make that a priority for a long period of time, no matter what other significant issues come up. We've always failed at that. And it seems to me that that's a lesson that we're not really grappling with today. That in a sense, that's one of the lessons from Reconstruction that we have to take today, but we're missing that, I think. And
Isn't that part of the argument that Du Bois is making in Black Reconstruction, right? That it is, in fact, black workers and by black workers, he's essentially meaning all African Americans, you know, are playing this active role in both reconstructing the South and reconstructing the nation, that their activities in terms of legislation, bills that are passed in the South, because there are black legislatures in the South prior to 1875. There are blacks involved in creating new businesses and developing new kinds of crops. You get a whole, in Minnesota, you get a whole host of workers in various occupations. Some of them are domestic, some of them are service-oriented, but you get people in the trades, because there are many trades unions in Minnesota that are open to African Americans as compared to other states, with, of course, the exception of the railroad brotherhoods. You get new businesses. And I think one of the ways in which Minnesotans, black Minnesotans, are making an impact on policy may not be directly through creating legislation, but the fact that they are interacting with those legislators as barbers, as shoemakers, bootblacks, and they're hearing some of the discussions that are going on and are able to pass that information on to other African Americans.
At the same time, you're right about that, absolutely. The Minnesota passed Public Accommodations Act for itself, and the final amendment to that act was drafted and sponsored by a black attorney who represented Minneapolis, Frank Wheaton. He drafted it along with another African-American attorney who you referred to, Richard Morris. So we're talking about creating laws that ban discrimination in the public places, in restaurants and opera houses and wherever. No more discrimination. And yet discrimination continues. The same sponsor of that bill goes to dinner at a restaurant just down the street from the legislature and is denied service. He goes to another restaurant and the owner seasons the food with pepper so that it's inedible. And so you have, and that kind of, that practice is widespread throughout at least the Twin Cities, where you have the largest number of African Americans. And so it takes a while I mean, this, one final example, I mean, we talk about Nellie Francis. Well, we didn't talk about Nellie Francis. We should talk about Nellie Francis, African-American woman who not only was one of the leaders of the suffrage movement and helped to get it ratified in 1919 in Minnesota at least, and helped African-American women learn how to vote with the first time they held the ballot in their hand in 1920. But the following year actually was one of the principles behind passage of an anti-lynching law. Yeah, lynching was not a crime up until the time this law was created. And she was successful. She walked down the halls of the state capitol talking to the legislators, virtually unanimous in support of enacting that law. She was a real hero. But she was also, when she moved to another neighborhood, in the Mac Groveland neighborhood, and I think it's a story that many of you probably are familiar with. A lot has been written and performed on this issue. She and her husband were exposed to harassment by supremacists, Klansmen, and whatnot. That's part of the paradox that is Minnesota. 1917, you have a situation where African Americans walk out of their places of business and they see a parade of Klansmen driving cars, and it's part of a promotion for car sales. But these guys are wearing hoods and hats through the streets. And just a couple months later, World War I begins. And there's an effort to save the world for democracy. And there's no discussion on the part of policymakers as to the contradiction with that. That's a part of race relations in Minnesota during this time period as well.
But along with that, you find out that African Americans served in Minnesota African Americans served in World War I's in greater percentage numbers than white Minnesotans did, right? So, you know, as much as you were discriminated against, segregated, because they were in segregated troops, they were also patriots. They were also actively supporting this war to end all wars, or the war for democracy, right? But back to your point about Minnesota's role in national kind of affairs, William T. Francis, you know, becomes the ambassador to Liberia, right? I mean, a Minnesotan who has not only a national presence, but now an international presence. And that's kind of foreshadowing, as you mentioned earlier, the Roy Wilkinses and the Whitney Youngs and the Anna Hedgemans, you know, that Minnesotans not only, you know, are active local, statewide, nationally, as well as internationally. You know, and that's something I think, again, to at least let our children know of these possibilities and these opportunities that exist, even though there are contradictions.
I mean, you talk about contradictions. I'm reminded of Jim Thompson, sort of thought of as the first African-American resident of St. Paul. He was in that first sort of group of squatters that were kicked off Fort Snelling. And he helped build some of the actual first physical buildings that became the city of St. Paul,
Yes.
you know, back when it was sort of referred to as Pig's Eye. And his neighbor, who was the son of the man who had purchased him while he was enslaved and freed him, was one who went up to the Capitol and suggested that suffrage only be allowed to white men in Minnesota territory. And eventually...
It's nothing personal.
This was his name. This is, yeah. So you think about from that early moments of the settlement, you know, this American settler colony of St. Paul, it can, you know, there's these multiple, it's the same cycle that continues in different scales and in different examples.
But isn't Thompson also one of the founders of the state, the Sons of the State of Minnesota or something like that? One of the earliest societies in Minnesota. He is one of those founding members.
He was, in terms of being an early old settler?
Yes.
He was a member. He did become a member of that society that
Yes.
formed. Yeah, he was the only African American.
Only African American, yeah.
Yeah.
The other person, you know, I think the one sphere that we haven't talked about, I think, is religion and the roles of the churches, right? Because, you know, the church has been a space in which African Americans were able, one, to express themselves, but also to develop leadership. And let's say here in Minnesota, you do have Pilgrim Baptist Church, you do have St. James AME, but you also have St. Peter Claver, where, you know, Bishop Ireland, you know, who is white, who grows up in St. Paul, or lives in St. Paul as a young person, he wasn't born here, but he lived in a neighborhood that he had black residents living around him prior to him becoming a priest. And then years later, he then recognizes a need to bring in black Catholics into the Catholic Church and to have representation. And so he hires Reverend Theobald, who is an African American from the Caribbean, to be the parish priest at St. Peter Claver. You know, so there are these race relations that are going on at a number of different levels, I think, that influence how we understand race relations, racial relations, interracial relations, biracial relations. You know, because there's a small black community who's interacting with a lot of other people who aren't black.
I do want to leave some time for questions from our audience, because you may have topics you're interested in. We can see what, and then open it up. So if you do have a question for our guests, feel free to raise your hand. I'll run a mic to you so that we can hear it. We're also recording this, so we want to make sure that's heard on the recording. So raise your hand and I can come and, we got one up there, and then this is how I get my exercise.
Okay.
Thank you, thank you. And thank you, gentlemen, for that wonderful presentation. I wonder if you could say just a bit more. We all know about the meanness and cruelty of the South and their unabashed promotion and support of the doctrine of white supremacy, which is in effect to practitioners in the South, their religion. I think it's religion, the thing to which people owe their highest loyalty has always been religion. And in this case, it's race in America. So I wonder if you could talk a little more about how complicit the North was in working with the defeated South, the old oligarchy, and the business class getting together of doing some pretty bad things, particularly at prestigious schools like the Dunning School of History at Columbia and Harvard. Many scholars created what we call racism, very brilliant people. I wonder if you could just say how complicit the North was. We know the South was mean and ugly. Can you say something about the northern part of promoting and resuppressing black people?
I'll start. Thank you for the question. One of the things that this exhibit is trying to do, or the museum, the Minnesota History Center is trying to do, is to add supporting programming. And there is going to be a program on March 9th by Dano Iacovone, who wrote a book, to your point, Teaching White Supremacy. The book is an incredible tale of the way in which Northern publishers, textbook publishers, have been complicit in the spread of white supremacist doctrine, white supremacist attitudes through textbooks. Textbooks that have been used in schools, colleges, universities since the founding of the nation. You know, that is one way in which, left unchallenged, students, young minds, get infected with these notions of superiority and inferiority of one group over the other.
I would only add that the conflict among clergy, both during this period, 19th century and present day, was over the issue of how active ought clergy be in dealing with injustice. I mean, King talks about this, where he's in the jails in Birmingham, and he writes about his frustration with his clerical brethren who feel that he is not really doing God's will, that it is not in the response, is not in the province of the church to get into politics. And some went further in saying it's not our responsibility to change God's will in looking at or creating a society that make African Americans and all people equal. So there are all sorts of interesting ways that the clergy during that period were on both sides of the issue, and even those who were in support of justice found a way oftentimes to mollify the darker forces in their own communities for all sorts of reasons. And they tolerated it. So, well, I'll stop there.
You know, the exhibit is called Black Citizenship in the Age of Jim Crow. Jim Crow is a character or a caricature that was created by a white actor who observed a crippled black man in the 1830s dancing in clothes that were torn or tattered. He saw that, thought it was funny, and began to imitate that, took the man's clothes, or borrowed the man's clothes, I don't mean steal, but, and put soot on his face, and then began to perform as if he were this crippled black man. And he called this character Jim Crow. That act became perhaps one of the most popular acts in the traveling circuses of the time. It actually, some people say, that is the birth of popular culture in the United States. That others then began to imitate. Daddy Rice was his name. And they would go around the country, you know, performing this caricature in white communities, so that for some, their first exposure to a black man was this Jim Crow character. That's how insidious the phenomena became. That all of a sudden, someone who has never ever met a black person views this caricature as a typical example of what black people are. And so white supremacy is not simply a power relationship, a political power relationship, or an economic relationship. It's also this cultural phenomenon.
There's a moment in that exhibit that talks about Frederick Douglass's insistence on being photographed as often as he could, so that he could counteract all of the racial caricatures that were being circulated, often by northern publishers and presses. So that he was trying to do, in that small way, a different impression of what African Americans were, who they were, what they were capable and accomplished, and all of those things.
Jacob, there was a question, right? One in front of you and one 4 rows back.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm wondering if we could bring this conversation to the present moment and talk about how there's a book called Third Reconstruction, and it's trying to think about it with Obama coming into office. And so how do you make sense of our failed moment after 2020, of another moment where there was hope around abolition, there was hope around reimagining the Minneapolis Police Department and public safety, and we're still kind of crumbling to figure out what that looks like. So can you talk about what does Reconstruction mean after Obama and after 2020 in Minneapolis?
He's the You give us the historical perspective on that.
Well, that's the question to ask. It's precisely the question to ask. And the fact that there are no easy answers based on what's happened in the past, I guess, is a reason for why people walk away from the question. And I think, it goes back to what I was saying before, that I don't know if I said this, I say this a lot in my sleep at least, or when I'm talking to my own kids, we instead of seeing the big questions, the difficult questions, and confronting them, knowing that we're not going to come up with an easy answer, and that we're going to need dialogue with other people to help come up collectively with a new answer, and that answer includes a commitment, finding a way to keep society committed to changing its ways. Unless we can figure that out, we're going to be doing the same thing over and over again. I got to tell you, during the days of, rage a couple years ago, I got all kinds of phone calls from journalists from all over, not just the country, but the world, well, Europe, because they were stunned at what they saw, George Floyd and all that, in Minneapolis, liberal Minneapolis. And they wanted me to comment on that. And, I did the best I could, but the long and the short of it was that they were wondering, is this the beginning of something new? Because this is what they really wanted an answer for. But they weren't happy with the answer that I gave, which was, it remains to be seen. Because I have seen black and white people, old and young people, walk the streets of the big cities in the nation protesting for social justice in the 60s. And what happened after that time period? Well, we get Richard Nixon, President of the United States, and a whole series of reaction to the new frontier that are still in place today. It seems to me that that's an example of the notion of fatigue that I mentioned earlier with regard to Reconstruction. That the truly meaningful questions, the truly large and significant challenges that this society faces in order to move forward are too exhausting to see through. And so we find other things to think about. We're about to have the Super Bowl sometime, and that's important. We're about to wonder whether Taylor Swift and, I got to tell you, my wife got on me last night about, my thing about Taylor Swift, who I think is a wonderful singer and all that, but I don't know her music. But my kids do, my grandchildren do. But this is what's important now to the media. We still have issues in schools. We still have issues in housing, employment. You go down the line. Are families going to be able to, food security, those are still problems. But I don't hear that as part of the political dialogue of, some politicians may talk about it when they're running for office, or may not. But up here, I don't hear it. I don't hear that discussion. They don't talk about it because they don't think we want to hear about it either. That's another thing. They get their play. They, meaning the politicians, get their lead from what they think the public wants to hear or what voters want to hear. And so in a sense, it's kind of our responsibility to keep it in front of them, and we don't do that. We don't do that. The issues that children in school face today faced 10 years ago, 20 years ago when I was dealing with that world. And even longer than that, further back than that.
I haven't read Third Reconstruction, so I can't comment on it. I do think that Reconstruction generally applies to something that happens after war, and I'm not sure if there's actually been the third war, whatever, that justifies that name. Although I think the phenomenon of what I've labeled as the third slavery, is a current, ongoing phenomenon. There are two historians in this room who I admire. One I'm sitting next to. One of them I once heard say, quoting Frederick Douglass, "Where there is no struggle, there is no progress." And Dr. Green just mentioned earlier that there needs to be a continuity of, and there has been a continuity of struggle in this society. That black folks have continually been in struggle. That what happened in 2020 in Minneapolis, I was actually in Michigan and I was actually reading, but I had the television on with the sound turned down. And I saw this image of this police officer on top of this black man, and I thought, oh, I went back to read. I look up again, and the police officer's in there. I'm like, that's strange. Go back to read. I look up again, and I say, "You're killing him," to the television. And then I turn on the sound. And just like you, people knew that I was from Minnesota, start calling me in Michigan saying, "James, what's going on?
Explain yourself.
That's Minnesota. Why?" I said, "You don't know." I said, "Watch out, because what's going to happen next is going to be big." There's still struggle. There is still struggle. We continue to struggle. And it's not something that's going to be solved in a day or in an instant or in one conversation or one conference. It's an ongoing thing. Where we go from here, I'm not sure. There's a generational shift coming, whether we like it or not. Some of the activist leaders from the 1960s, are not going to be here, let's say, at least 20 years from now. And there are new leaders, younger leaders, coming into the picture. Hopefully there's a generational sharing of information, that we can help process what happens next. And I often say to people of that era, there was also a generational shift in the 1960s, right? Because we lost a W.E.B. Du Bois, we lost an Anna Julia Cooper, we lost a Zora Neale Hurston, we lost a Richard Wright, we lost Langston Hughes, we lost a whole score of previous intellectual leaders in the black community. And all of a sudden, you get these, 18, 19, 20-year-olds talking about black history and black studies and black power, and without those wizened leaders to provide a perspective. We still have these elders, around who perhaps can provide not leadership, but advice, guidance, wisdom. Because the struggle is going to continue. Because white supremacy continues. We have people who don't want us to read books, right?
On the other side of this, I agree with everything you said. I would just add, and I don't have an answer for you, okay? But it strikes me that one of the challenges that the old folks face, not yourself, but, you know, I'm certainly included in that, is the ability to listen to the young folks too. Because, you know, I think one thing that is easy for people of my generation to do is to presume that the young folks have nothing to say that we need to listen to because we've lived it. And, you know, so it takes a couple people to be able to really learn from each other. You know, a certain degree of humility has to set in. That I know what happened in my time, and I think I understand why things brought us Richard Nixon. To name a politician, I don't mean to be trashing him, but what do we learn about ourselves that create a society that needs him? And what can we learn from, I mean, the young people are going to be out in front. They have things, they're putting stuff on the line. And they deserve our support, which means an open ear, if nothing else. Yes, we've got information to share. We hope you can hear this information. But we also recognize that you're living a different world as well, that you should have the power to address in your own terms, your own way. So I'm just reminding myself to refrain from telling my kids how they should live their lives. And that's not an easy task.
Yeah, I think we have time for maybe one more question. I think I saw some up here. I know there's probably plenty more.
After the previous discussion, Dr. Robinson, I just wanted you to go back, if you would, and talk about the term copperhead. I wasn't familiar with that.
Yeah. As I understand it, Copperheads were essentially Northern sympathizers of the Confederacy. Okay, they were whites who, and they were in Minnesota, who actively supported the Confederate cause.
Well, maybe one more quick question, so we get.
Top row.
We'll do.
You got three more questions.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Dr. Robinson, Dr. Green. I'd like to ask a two-part question very briefly. Number one, Minnesota was among the first states to commit troops to President Lincoln to fight in the Civil War, including almost half of the African-American adult population. I was wondering if you could comment on what benefits those soldiers derived upon returning from the Civil War, those who survived it. Number two, could you briefly explain the African-American behavioral bond of that period in time? And I wanted to thank you for the kind remarks that you made about my great uncle, Frederick McGee.
I teach a class called African Americans in Minnesota at Metropolitan State University. And one of the things that I talk to my students about is that in Minnesota, there seem to be 5 areas of struggle that we've been engaged in. Struggle for rights, struggle for education, struggle for employment, struggle for housing, and this other area that is kind of harder to categorize. You might call it friendship, you might call it a common good. And I think one of the things that these colored troops from Minnesota were trying to affect was this common good. That we are a part of this nation. It is ours to fight for as well. And if we do that, we will get rewarded. If not in terms of some sort of monetary reward or some sort of medal, but the respect of our fellow citizens. All right? Did that always happen? I can't say. Did they come back and have to suffer? I know that some of them did. What is impressive, though, I think, is that they came back to Minnesota and they established communities. And those communities thrived.
Yeah, they even agitated for better education facilities. I mean, their kids were going to schools, were going to a school in St. Paul in particular that had no windows, no blackboard, no chalk, no light inside, and many of the kids who were in those schools were from the South. So you can imagine what it's like enduring for the first or second time a Minnesota winter when they had Minnesota winters. There were black veterans who actually organized to put pressure on the school board, St. Paul School Board, to deal with the facilities of the schools of their kids. And it was in part because of their agitation that the state legislature in 1869 banned school discrimination in schools. They said basically if a school system in Minnesota continues to discriminate against kids, then that school district will lose state funding. Think about how far we've come since then. But that was one of the things that the military.
I know there are more questions, but I do want to be respectful of everyone's times, especially our guests. Before we wrap up, I want to draw attention to another program that's coming up March 30th with Robert Parkinson on his book, 13 Clocks. He's looking at the media ecosystem in the colonial newspaper era. And he's looking at the ways that 13 distinct and unique colonies that didn't always agree, particularly around one big topic, slavery, were able to unify for independence. And the results of his research is pretty disturbing. He looks at the ways that racial fear was used to motivate people to unify again for the cause of revolution. So another timely topic that, again, it seems like old history seems to be very relevant today, but I wanted to draw your attention to that. You got a eval sheet. Any feedback you get for us is really welcome. I read every single comment on these programs. I really value the feedback, so if you have the time, 5 minutes to fill that out, drop it off at the table. Really appreciate that. But thank you for coming and joining me. Oh,
Before, I would like to also announce another program here at the Minnesota History Center next week, the 17th?
2 weeks. Oh,
2
the
weeks.
McRae All-Stars.
Yes, the McRae All-Star film.
Yes.
A really incredible group of young athletes over in South Minneapolis, excuse me. Sorry for the north side, south side split. South Minneapolis, who became very, very successful young athletes, champions, traveled around the country, represented the state of Minnesota. Phenomenal story. At one point in time, I refereed their basketball game, but that was long ago.
As part of a terrific series that Ralph Crowder has been doing with us before the Mayflowers landed, so check that out. Again, big round of applause for our guests, Dr. James Robinson and Dr. Bill Green.